Today we will continue our lectures and with Module 1. So today we will complete Module 1 with learning about modeling a database. So how do we model a database? And so we will go through the 4 rules in order to create an entity relationship diagram, or we call it the relational schema. So let's go over those rules one at a time. So the first rule is nouns and verbs. So when we say, and for an entity relationship diagram, it has nouns and verbs. So the nouns, basically an entity is an object. That object can be human, it can be a thing, a non-human thing, it can be anything that we want to keep track of. So it can be similar, a noun can be a bird, or an object or an entity can be a bird. It can be a birdhouse, it can be a patient, it can be anything that we want to keep track of. And there is also, we said, a noun and a verb. So the verb is basically the relationship between those two nouns, for example. So the relationship between those two nouns is actually lives in, that's the verb. And also there is cardinality, which basically tells us the amount of instances that can be included in the other entity. So for example here, when we read this relationship between the bird and the birdhouse, we say every bird, so I will read it from left to right. So every bird lives in, one and only one birdhouse. And then I will read it also from right to left, and we will practice a lot actually about how to read relationships between two entities. So every birdhouse, so when I read it from right to left, I would say every birdhouse is lived in, so in a passive sentence, is lived in, so every birdhouse is lived in by 0 or many birds. So let's continue. So again, entities refers to anything that we want to keep track of in a database. So it can be a bird, a tree, nest, drug, patient, doctor, and so on. So again, we said for every for entity relationship diagrams, we need to have nouns and verbs. So an example for the relationship between the nest and the tree. So now we know the nouns. What about the verbs? So every nest sits in a tree, and every tree is sat on a nest. So now we are familiar with the nouns and verbs, but cardinality is another aspect of those nouns and verbs. So cardinality is referring to the number of instances in a given entity that are associated with another given entity. So let's look at this example that we talked about earlier. So every bird lives in one and only one birdhouse, and every birdhouse is lived in by one or actually 0 or many birds. So that's how we read it from right to left, and those are the cardinalities. So we use the feet of crows, or so we call it crow's feet, which refers to the many side. So now let's read this from one side, read the relationships from one side. Let's say, for example, if I am reading this relationship here in the right side, or from left to right. So I would say 0 or 1 birdhouse, and this one will be 0 or many. So as you can see here, the dash or the straight dash refers to 1, and the circle refers to 0. And then the cross leg or feet stands for many. So in here I will say 0 or many birdhouse. And this one and only one birdhouse. And this one is 1 or many birdhouse. All right, so now we should be familiar with how to read relationships, but this slide here we will learn about how we can read it read the relationship between two entities from left to right first, and then from left to right first, and then from right to left second. And this is kind of the order how it goes. So we start from the left by stating the name of that entity, and then we jump into the verb, and then we jump on to the far right side cardinality. So I personally like to start reading entities or relationships between entities by using the keyword every. So I would say every bird lives in one and only one bird house. So very simple. Every bird lives in one and only one bird house. Now when we read it from right to left, we use the passive tense of a sentence. So I will start from the far right, where I would say every bird house, and then we'll jump into the verb, and then we will go to the cardinality in the far left. So I will say every bird house is lived in by zero or many birds. Okay, very simple, very straightforward. Let me read it one more time from right to left. So every bird house is lived in by zero or many birds. Very simple, right? So you got it. I'm sure you should be comfortable with reading the relationships now. So the first rule was nouns and verbs. So we identified the name of the entities and also the cardinalities and the verbs between those. So that was the first step. So now, second step is, let's practice actually reading those. So I will let you actually read. I will read one for you, or I will read them really quick for you, and then I will ask you to practice more with those. So I would say every automobile uses one and only one tire size. Every tire size is used by one or many automobiles, right? So I will ask you to read them before you listen to mine, but to see if you got them correct, and maybe you can take note and write down your answers, then compare them with mine for practice. So for me, I will say for the second one, every person has one and only one blood type, and every blood type classifies. Here we can actually use another verb, or we can actually say every blood type is had by one or many persons. So that's another way you can read it. So the last one is every fingerprint belongs to one and only one person, and every person has one and only one fingerprint. Very straightforward, very simple, right? So now if we want to practice and reading those, or how we can create an ERD for those scenarios. So because this is very similar to how your homework and the exam will be. This is the simple ones, and then we will move on to more advanced ones as well. So the first one, it says a course may have no textbook or several. A given textbook is used in one and only one course. So can we build or create an entity relationship diagram for this using the nouns and verbs? So we will have two boxes or rectangles. So for the nouns, so we have one noun is called course, and the other noun is the textbook. So now we have our nouns. So what is the relationship between them, or the cardinalities between them? So we can say every course has zero or many textbooks, and every textbook has or belongs to one and only one course, right? So let's look at it. So we say every course uses zero or many textbooks. This is exactly how it is read here. And then every textbook is used by one and only one course. Very simple. So for the second one, an instructor may teach several courses, one or several courses, but each course is taught by one and only one course. So now we have our two entities, the instructor and the course. And the cardinality, we can say every instructor teaches one or many courses, and every course is taught by one and only one instructor. Straightforward, very simple, right? So we can say 0 or 1. So this one is actually optional. What I really judge, or I will take points, or I will be very strict about when grading is the maximum cardinality. So the maximum cardinality are the ones farthest from the middle. So basically the mini, and here is the one. So basically the mini. This one here, it's optional. You can say 1 or 0 based on the business rule. So every course uses 0 or mini textbooks. So what is really important is the mini. And the 0 here, if you say 1 or mini or 0 or mini, both will be considered correct. So based on your own interpretation. So again, if you said 1 or mini in this side, or 0 or mini, it will be correct. So you will be fine. So of course, unless I mentioned it here somewhere. So here I said have no textbook or several. So here we say 0 or, but here an instructor may teach several courses. So may teach several courses. I didn't say may teach no course, but may also teach several courses. Then it is kind of optional. Again, so now let's move on to the third one. A course has several sections. Each section pertains to only one course. So again, here you can say we have the two entities, is the course and the section. So every course has, let's say, 1 or many sections. Every section belongs to one and only one course, right? So again, here if you say 1 or many or 0 or many will be correct as well, because here I didn't specify whether it is 1 or many. All right, so what we mean here by attributes is basically what are the fields, or what is the data that we want to collect about or to keep track of for this entity or for this object. So as you can see here, the attributes for a bird is the head, and so on, the tail, and so on. All right, so now what we mean by attributes, we will need to specify the attributes actually include the primary key and also the other columns or fields that we want to keep track of for this particular entity. For example, the employee. We need to have a primary key which is uniquely identifying every record in the employee table. So a primary key, and then we need to have, let's say, the first name or the name of the employee. We need their address, their phone number, maybe date of birth, and so on. So those are all considered attributes of that entity. So a project ID here is a foreign key. Employee name, remember here, for the homework and also for the exam, you will be judged by the notations. So here we are using, for employee name, I put in parentheses and 3 dots, which represents a composite key. So composite key meaning that it consists of more than one thing. So for example, the employee name, we have first name, we have middle name, and we have last name. So that's why I put it in parentheses as composite notation. And then for address, the same thing. It is a composite key because it consists of, let's say, it consists of street address, state, and then city and zip code, and so on. So I put this notation to represent that there are more than just this one. So there are more fields to it. And then age, it is represented with bracket, and the bracket here represents that this field is derived from another field in this table. So age is derived from the date of birth. Because if I say this year, my age is 20, and then 3 years later, it will stay 20. But in reality, no, I grew up 3 more years, so it is not accurate. Therefore, it should be derived from the date of birth to be more accurate. So now, so the date of birth, and then the phone number. So this is, we call it multi-value. So multi-value when we have more than one phone number. So we have a cell phone, we have work phone, and we have home phone, and so on. So we have multi-value. So we put it in curly bracket. So again, remember to use those notations when you submit your homework and also for the exam. So primary key. Primary key, every entity or every table has to have a primary key. This primary key uniquely identifies every record in that table. So, and we have two types of primary keys. So there is the semantic or natural keys. So for example, if I have a table that is about colors, so every color, actually I can use the name of the color as a primary key for the color table because it is semantic, it's natural. So I can say yellow, blue, because it is uniquely identifying every record in that color table. So in that's an example of a semantic natural key. And some people also can use Social Security as semantic because it has a meaning, so you can use it for other things as well. But the other type of primary key is called artificial key. Artificial key is a surrogate key or a key that automatically created by the database management system. So for example, an artificial key can start from 1 all the way on to and so on to infinity. So in that case, this key doesn't have a meaning per se. So 1, 2, 3, 4, it just keeps the records unique in that table or that entity. So we call it artificial key. It doesn't necessarily have a meaning, such as the customer ID or visit ID or student ID. So as you can see, it doesn't have necessarily a meaning. It's just kind of to keep it unique for every student and for every employee. All right, so again, one of the characteristics of a primary key, it has to always be filled in. So we can't have a primary key that is null or blank. It has to be filled in. And also the primary key should not change. So it doesn't change over time. It is constant. So those are the characteristics of a primary key. So now the second criteria or rule for entity relationship diagrams modeling is primary key. We need to have primary key. So, and those primary keys, they need to be unique, not null, meaning not blank, and they don't change over time. So let's look at this example. So we have a customer table that collects attributes or collect data about the customer name, their phone number, and address. So in this case, what would you suggest would be an appropriate primary key for the customer table? So I will definitely use an artificial key. In this case, I will call it customer ID, right? And then what would be a good primary key for the sales rep table? Sales rep ID or rep ID, right? So whatever you give it a name, as long as it has an ID in it, or then it will be fine. So again, here we will have customer ID as a primary key for the customer table, and then the rep ID for the rep table. Now, another thing is where to put the primary key. So the other question is, where should we put the primary key? So the primary key is always recommended to be put in the menu side. So this is kind of a rule of thumb. The primary key is always put in the menu side. So now if we say we can read this relationship between customer and rep, so every rep sells to, let's say, one or many customers, and every customer is sold to by one and only one rep, right? So now the one side is here and the many side is in the customer table. So in this case, I will put the foreign key in the many side. So this is the many side, the customer ID is the many side. So I'll put the rep in ID in the customer side and the customer table side. All right, so as you can see here, I added the rep as a foreign key. All right, so now this is the mandatory side, or what we call it in other words, I say the foreign key is always placed in the mini side. So that's rule number 3. All right, so now let's look at this scenario. I will let you read it, and then we can identify from this scenario that we want to keep track of puppies, and puppies are bought by customers, and also they are sold by stores. So in other words, we have 3 entities. So we have puppies, we have customers, and we have stores. And also the scenario here gives us more details what we want to keep track of in terms of the puppy breeds, ages, and so on, and also the customers. Those are the attributes we want to collect about the customers, and also what the stores we have, the attributes are also stated for us there. So now let's build or create an ERD, or entity relationship diagram, for this scenario. So to do that, what we will do is, first we will follow those rules. So we will start by declaring or listing the nouns and verbs with cardinalities, and then the second step is we will identify the primary keys for each of those entities, and then the third step is we will decide where to put the foreign keys based on this rule of thumb. Always the foreign keys are placed in the mini side. So let's do that. Now we know our entities. We have 3 entities, so we'll list them. We'll go one at a time. So the first step is noun and verbs, primary keys, and mandatory side. So let's do that. So list the nouns first. We listed the nouns, so we have puppy, customer, and store. Second step is the verbs, or the cardinalities. So the cardinalities. So we say every puppy is sold by one and only one store, right? And every store sells mini puppies. Very simple. And then we can say every customer buys one or many, or 0 or many puppies, and every puppy is bought by one and only one customer. As I said, the minimum cardinality should be flexible, but what is really important is the maximum cardinality. So now we have the cardinalities based on what we read. So every puppy is bought, or actually every puppy is sold by one and only one store, and every store sells one or many puppies. The same thing here, every puppy is bought by one and only one customer, and every customer buys one or many puppies. All right, so now we have the cardinalities. Second step is the primary key and foreign keys, or just actually the primary keys. So what is a good primary key for puppy? I will let you think for a moment. What would be a good one? Would a puppy ID would be good? Store ID would be good? And customer ID would be good, right? I think that works. That works for me, and you already figured it out. So now we need to decide where to put the foreign key. So the mandatory, remember the third rule is the mandatory side, or what we can call it is where to put the foreign key. So now we have primary keys. So again, the rule of thumb for the third step is to put the foreign key in the mini sides. So now where is the mini side? We have a mini side between those two. So that means I need to put the store ID as a foreign key here. And I need to put the customer ID as a foreign key also in the puppy table. This is exactly what we did, rule of thumbs. Simple. Now I can list the rest of the attributes with their notations, right? So now the store location, it has street address, it has also city, state, and zip. That's why I put it in parentheses with 3 dots, means composite. And again here the customer phone is actually multi-valued, and so on. So you get the idea. Now we created a very beautiful ERD diagram, right? So now let's practice by creating an entity relationship, or an entity for this particular scenario. So we have an entity called zoo animal, and it has animal ID as its primary key. And so this is how you are going to create your entities in the homework. Is you will create, I will show you also how to use Lucidchart to create those entities with those notations. Okay, so we have the name of the entity in the top, and then if it is a primary key, we will put a PK in that box, and then the name of that attribute. And if it is a foreign key, we put it as FK, and then the name of the attribute, and so on. You got the idea. Now you can also draw this one. I'll let you draw this one also based on that scenario. So the vendor ID with the notations. So now let's look at this scenario. A course may have no textbook or several. A given textbook is used in one and only one course. So this is very simple, kind of to create an entity relationship diagram for it. So we have two entities. We have a course and a textbook. So every course has 0 or many textbooks. Every textbook is assigned or belongs to one and only one course book or course. So, and we have their attributes here, so we can just draw them very straightforward. And then the foreign key, we put it in the mini site. So you can see that the course number, which is the primary key for the course, was put as a foreign key in the mini site. Very simple. So now let's look at this one. This is another example. So every instructor may teach several courses, and every course is taught by one and only one instructor. And we have their attributes here. So instructor, I will give him, so the first rule is to put the nouns and verbs. So the first rule is nouns and verbs. So we have the nouns are the instructor and the courses. And the relationships or the verbs, so every instructor teaches, so the verb is teaches, and the cardinality will be every instructor teaches one or many courses. Every course is taught by one and only one instructor. So the second step or the second rule is to the primary key. So what would be a primary key? Good primary key for instructor ID, course number, right? So now we have those two guys. And then the last one is where to put the foreign key. Very straightforward. We'll put so the first step is nouns. State the nouns. Second step, so we say nouns and verbs. So that was the first rule. Then the verbs includes the cardinality. So if an instructor teaches one or many courses, every course is taught by one and only one instructor. So this is how we put it. And then the second rule is the primary key. Instructor ID and course number will be good IDs, primary keys. And then we list where to put the foreign key. That's the third rule. So usually, as we said, the rule of thumb for where to put the foreign key is always in the mini site. So that means we put a foreign key here, which comes from the instructor table. So instructor ID will be in the course table as a foreign key, right? So now we can list the rest of the shebang or whatever it is attributes that we have here with their notations, as we have learned already. Perfect. So now we should be comfortable with creating entity relationship diagrams and draw them in a correct way. So now there is another case where we have a many-to-many relationship. So we don't have a one-to-many relationships, but we end up with, or we might have a many-to-many relationships, like for example between the bird and the feeders. So every bird eats from one or many feeders. Every feeder is ate by 0 or many birds. So in this case, if we have a many-to-many relationships, all of those, what we call them, relational database management systems such as Microsoft Access, SQL Server, DB2 of IBM, and Oracle and MySQL, those relationship or relational database management systems, they don't allow us to have a many-to-many relationship between two tables or two entities. Therefore, we need to break, if we have a many-to-many relationship like this case, we need to create an associative entity in the middle. So we call it associative entity that consists of the primary key from both tables, and we include them in that associative entity which is in the middle. So this is what we will have. If we have a bird and the relationship between a bird and feeder is many to many, we create an associative entity. In this case, we call it a visit or visit entity. Usually that associative entity has the many side. So it has the many side from here and also here. And it consists of the primary key from the feeder and the primary key from the bird as foreign keys. All right, so again, the associative entity has the many sides. So remember, when you create for the homework or for the exam, if we have a many-to-many relationship, create an associative entity, you give it a name. You give it a name. If I didn't tell you what you name it, just you name it whatever you want. All right, and the many side is always on that associative entity, and the foreign keys are always included also here. So the bird ID will be included as a foreign key in the visit table, and the feeder ID will be included in the visit table. All right, so now let's look at this guy. So the bird, we have the bird and the bird ID as a primary key, feeder ID as its primary key. They must be included in this associative entity. All right, so you can see them that they are included as foreign keys, and then the rest of the attributes that we want. So this should be our last rule of thumb, which is if we have a many-to-many relationship, we create an associative entity that consists of the primary keys of both entities as foreign keys in that associative entity, and the many side is always in that associative entity. All right, so now let's think about this scenario. So we have teacher and courses, and we have students. So we have three entities. So the relationship between a teacher and a course. So a teacher teaches one or many courses. Every course is taught by one and only one course. But what about the relationship between the course and the student? So every course is taken by one or many students, but every student also takes one or many courses. So in this case, so every teacher teaches one or many courses. Every course is taught by one and only one course, right? And then every student takes one or many courses. Every course is taken by one or many students. So now we have a problem. If we have a many-to-many relationship, that is a problem. We need to create an associative entity here in the middle. So we need to break this relationship by creating a middle entity. We call it associative entity. You can call it whatever you want. Some people might call it registration, some might call it grade, whatever you want to call it. So now this is what we will need to do. So we'll create, this one looks good to us. Now the student, so we need to break that relationship between the student and the course by creating a middle entity. We call it registration in this case. So now to follow our rules that we have learned, the 4 rules, the first rule is the nouns. So we have now all the nouns or the names of the entities, and verbs is the cardinality. So we already have the cardinalities between teacher and course. Now we need to have cardinality between the course and student, so including that middle entity. So remember when we said that cardinality, when we have, or the many side is always in that middle or an associative entity. So that's where you will see that we have the many side is always in that associative entity side. So now we got the first rule, the nouns and verbs. So we are good to go. Now the second rule is primary keys. So what would be a good primary key for teacher? Teacher ID, course, course number, student, student ID, registration, you can call it registration ID. All right. So now the third rule is where to put the foreign key. So now remember the foreign key we said is always put in the many side. So that means I need to take the teacher ID and put it in the mini side. All right, so that's one. What about the mini side here? So I have one coming from here, so that means the course number, I need to put it here, and the student ID, I need to put it also here in the mini side, right? Exactly. Now I can list the rest of the primary, or the rest of the keys here with their notations. So I'm good to go. So that was all that I wanted to cover today, and I will record in a little video a demo how to use Lewis C chart to create entity relationship diagrams. So I'll talk to you later.